I'm Chris Richardson, and welcome to Season 4 of This Is Not a Pipe podcast. I'm thrilled to be starting this season with Brian Jefferson speaking about his book, Digitize and Punish, Racial Criminalization in the Digital Age. Jefferson is an associate professor of geography and geographic information science at the University of Illinois, Urbana, Champaign. He edits the digital magazine Society in Space. He serves on the editorial boards of the Annals of the American Association of Geographers and Urban Geography, and of course is the author of Digitize and Punish. It's wonderful to be able to speak with him today about a number of really important events. Even though we don't necessarily talk about those events specifically, his book allows us to get the broader context of what's going on around us. And today, it feels like we're living through an apocalypse. 2020 is the worst year I can remember. People are dealing with a deadly pandemic as well as mass stupidity when it comes to the information people are telling each other or feeding each other, primarily through social media and other means of that nature. It's so disconcerting and overwhelming, but at the same time, I think it proves to us why this kind of discussion and this kind of work that Jefferson and so many people that I've been able to interview and will continue to interview, the work that they're doing allows us to better understand the world, and I think that's more important than ever. That's the one good thing about what's going on now, is that it highlights that and just how crucial it is to have these kinds of conversations. So I'm so thankful to him and to everyone else, as well as, of course, to the listeners and the people who have been supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. This is episode 70, and I honestly didn't think we would get to that, but it's been such a wonderful experience talking to people. I don't want to stop doing it, and so I'm not going to stop doing it, at least right now. I'm thrilled to be able to speak to people like this. As always, Jefferson and all of my interviewees provide their recommendations for readings that you can see at tinapp.org. You can check that out, see if there's some material there that maybe you hadn't heard of before. I know I personally love seeing the 5 recommended readings because it always starts me on a pattern that can lead to many interesting and different places that I hadn't expected, but reading recommendations and those things are always valuable to me. I hope they are to you as well. Also, if you want to support the podcast, there's always the Buy Me a Coffee button that you can press, in which you can literally donate $5 towards the podcast. And that really goes a long way towards getting books and getting the materials we need to keep this going. So I really do appreciate it when people do that. And if you can't do that, you can always repost, retweet, pass on this information, let people know about it. That also helps very much. So thank you very much for listening to This Is Not a Pipe podcast. Brian, thank you so much for being on. I'm thrilled to have you as the first interview of the new season. Let's get right to this book. As I said in the introduction, it's so important because it highlights a lot of things and helps us understand a lot of things that are going on. They seem new, and they are in some respects in the ways that we're doing things, but of course Deleuze, Foucault, really important thinkers, have been considering these things for decades now. So let's start with your book and what you set out to do. Maybe you can just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, so the book is, I think it builds on the work of a lot of previous studies that have looked at the relationship between political economy and anti-Black racism and the criminal justice system in specific. One of those cornerstone thinkers is W.E.B. Du Bois, who looked at the relationship between the breakdown of the slave plantation system and sort of the birth of industrial capitalism and the ways that fueled and transformed racism, in specific the criminal justice institution, among others. So one of the things he looks at is how sort of the explosion of unemployed, underemployed, impoverished Black people, as well as Black people who are competing with white people on the labor market, were sort of ejected into the political economy once slavery was abolished. Some of his works look at the way that the criminal justice institution was sort of restructured to deal with the Black population that was seen as threatening to white workers in the North and in the South. So that's one of the cornerstone works. And then, of course, Ruthie Gilmore's Golden Gulag is a major influence. And she looks at the sort of transformation of the manufacturing industry, defense manufacturing in California, and the ways in which the demise or the shrinking or outsourcing of that industry left large numbers of Latinx and Black unemployment. And again, the way that the criminal justice system was mobilized to sort of contain the wreckage and the social problems that come with mass unemployment. So what I wanted to do was, I thought it was just a really small shift of attention from industrial capitalism towards information capitalism, or the IT sector. And then looking at sort of since the ways in which the IT sector has planted itself within cities, post-industrial cities, and built up, smart cities. I'm trying to figure out the relation between that fraction of capital, the IT sector, and criminal justice in urban settings, and in specific anti-Black criminal justice policy, and anti-Latino criminal justice policy, and anti-poor criminal justice policy, and anti-immigrant criminal justice policy, but I look at that to a lesser extent. So I really want to understand the connections and the nexus between the IT industry, urban governance, and the racialized criminal justice system. And that's the basic architecture of the book. What I found was, I think it's a bit commonsensical, but that the IT industry, of course, has an interest in selling more surveillance cameras to cities, selling, of course, more GPS ankle monitors to cities, selling more technology to police officers for surveillance and for coordinating their deployments. The book is really just sort of a history of this relationship and a little bit of projecting where that relationship might go in the future.
Yeah, and maybe we could say a little bit about those intersections, because you seem to be coming from an interesting place in the sense that you're in geography, but you're also in sort of technology studies, but you're also critical race theory, political economy, as you mentioned, criminal justice, coming at it from a number of different perspectives or disciplinary frameworks. Maybe you could say a little bit about where you're coming from yourself, but also the kind of frameworks that you used and how you interlace them.
Oh, yeah. That's a deceptively, I think, difficult question to answer. Because one of the things I think that became apparent in doing the book was I would sort of have to put these disparate pieces together on my own. So my background personally is I am trained in political theory. So I always gravitate towards questions of the state. I would say that sort of influenced my interest in looking at urban governance and city governance, the state at the urban scale. So that would be, I think, one of the major dimensions. Next would be the IT industry. And here, this would be political economic framework. I would look at it, I think, from this perspective. Here, I think I had to draw on media studies, new media studies, a little more than I realized going into it. But looking at the history of telecommunications and how that sort of morphed into the history of IT companies as well, and trying to get a better sense of their relationship with the state and the way that the state has both created conditions for the IT industry to really flourish in cities, whether through tax abatements or through accommodating IT professionals and gentrifiers. So that there's a link there. Also looking at the ways in which I think what I tried to do that hopefully was new was to show how there's also a market niche for the IT industries within urban contexts for, of course, security technology. Most of the research was looking at war on terror, security infrastructure. So I sort of wanted to just shift attention a little bit toward criminal justice infrastructure. Here, I think new media studies really helped because they look at technology not only in sort of an abstract sense of, the epistemology of digital knowledge production, but they also, I think, are interested in concrete infrastructure, media infrastructure, like fiber optic cabling, like cellular towers. And they also, I think, are very good at looking at the history of these industries and the ways in which governments, have enacted policies to accommodate their growth. So media studies would be second. So you got the state, and you have technology, and I would say third would be the social. So I use racial capitalism as a framework, and of course, Cedric Robertson's book Black Marxism was probably the major work that's referenced when it comes to this intersection. But I would really go back to Du Bois, who also used essentially Marxian analysis. He did a degree in Germany, and Du Bois comes back to America, and he says, well, why is there no socialist revolution after the Civil War? Because you have all these poor white people who were denied agricultural jobs because of the slave system. And then you have poor black people who were freed after slavery was abolished. So you have a mass of poor, under and unemployed people, and you have a very small number of plantation owners. If the sort of really typical, more vulgar Marxist argument was correct, then that would have been fertile grounds for socialist revolution, for overthrowing the agricultural aristocracy, as he calls it. Mm-hmm. So Du Bois says, well, what is keeping this from happening? And from there, he says, well, race, the racial line, that's what kept the black workers and the white workers separate. That's what kept white workers, of course, hostile to black workers. Of course, Cedric Robertson, his book Black Marxism, looks at the racism that predated capitalism and the way that capitalists have seized upon already trenchant racism, forms of racism, and used it to their advantage. So when I think of the social sort of aspect in racism, it's definitely not in, this sort of vulgar, racist subordinate to economics, which I don't believe, but I do believe it's entangled. And I think, as I understand intersectional analysis, it's not that we privilege one over the other, but we try to understand the way that they intersect and mutually constitute, but also can undermine one another. So those would be the three major things. I would say the state and city government, the economic sphere, looking at the IT industry, and then the social sphere, looking at racialization and racism in the U.S. context. So those would be sort of the approaches. The frameworks would be, well, I guess they sort of overlap. There's definitely racial capitalism would be an analytical framework, looking at knowledge production in the vein of Foucault. But one of the really important readings that I did was Joy James, who wrote a book, Resisting Racial State Violence. And she has this really powerful essay in the book called Erasing the Spectacle. And she talks a lot about how the sort of preoccupation with knowledge production has given the impression that power in Western societies is becoming less violent. And she turns attention to indigenous and black people and says clearly the modernity, the disciplinary society towards these non-white groups cannot be classified as non-violent. Mm-hmm. So another thing I wanted to do was to sort of look at the influence of Foucault, of French post-structuralism in general, that is really pervasive in digital studies, and to say that not to deny that they have made enormous contributions, which they definitely have, but to say, hey, we should also, not look at the digitization or computerization of power as something that equates with less violent politics or less exclusionary politics. So that's sort of one of the ongoing struggles, I think, throughout the book, is to say, hey, we get a lot from post-structuralist theory, from Deleuze's theory of the control society, and how, the computer makes power more diffuse and less, at least ostensibly, violent. And these are great contributions, but we shouldn't think of it in a linear sense that the technology is making things less violent. There are also new forms of violence that are popping up, which use technology in order to coordinate themselves. And I think this is really obvious when you look at explicitly non-white, disadvantaged, minority, immigrant, global South groups. That's sort of what I was trying to pull together in looking at this one intersection.
Yeah, so pretty simple, basic stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a really nuanced argument that you lay out that definitely gets more and more complex the more you sort of unpeel these layers. But violence is an important element to it all, because I think the impression is that with computer technologies, things will be less violent. Violence will be able to be curtailed, but also racial violence, or even just the appearance of racial bias, will sort of magically disappear because of these algorithms that either don't look for race, or if they do look for race, they make sure that there's some kind of equilibrium. Obviously, that hasn't worked, particularly in America. Why is that? I mean, obviously, it's a very complex question, but in a general sense, algorithms and computer technology was supposed to curtail the potential racist police officer or the racist department because, it's a computer running it. Computers aren't racist. So what went wrong with that promise?
Yeah. So that would be the other side of the critique. So, on the first side, I guess, would be hopefully a constructive criticism of social theorists who look at the digital, or some. But on the other side, I think the critique you're raising is in many ways more important, or equally important at least, because it pertains to a critique of the tech industry, computer scientists, data scientists, who help design these algorithms. I think there's a big answer or a general answer and a specific answer I would give. First, in general, if we look at the use of algorithms, non-computer algorithms have been designed for decades, almost a century, to enact racist and ethnically biased policies. So, one of the things, it's a great book called Against Prediction by Bernard Harcourt, where he looks at these would be non-computer algorithms towards the early 1900s that were used for detecting juvenile delinquents, or for in the insurance sector for giving out loans. And these are algorithms in the sense that are mathematical. There are sets of instructions written in formal notation, and they were used to justify policies, to discriminate, in the case that he's looking at, often toward Eastern and Southern Europeans in Chicago. And so the algorithm has always been used and deployed in ways to justify or organize biased policies. I think the important thing is we should start with first, what policy is the algorithm designed to deliver or to enact? And if the policy that it's designed to help orchestrate is in itself a racist or xenophobic policy, then it doesn't matter how you write the algorithm. It's still being designed and deployed in service of a discriminatory project or initiative. So that would be the general one. I don't think it's a secret or very controversial to say that people who do get degrees and they study, in computer science or data science are not privy to really put their work within a broader historical context and a broader social context. And I think that's the job of the social scientist and the social theorist, is to show, just because something is written in mathematical notation doesn't mean it's objectively true, and it definitely doesn't mean that it's objectively good. So that would be my general response. My specific response into police technology and using predictive algorithms to try to find places where crimes might occur is, if we look at the way that police data are generated, they're generated by police reports. The police are deployed into certain neighborhoods according to certain policies, such as zero tolerance or quality of life. Therefore, they are going to find more crimes where they're deployed. It's a problem of measurement. It's an old problem that physicists talk about, right? that the instrument of measurement influences that which is being observed by the instrument. The instrument has to be present, and in this case, the instrument is the police patrol. So what happens is, if you deploy, all police in a small number of neighborhoods, they inevitably will find more crime in those neighborhoods. One thing that I often say to my students is, we all know that there's drug use, there's underage drinking, there are sexual crimes that happen in dorms across the United States of America. But if you don't station police inside those dorms in universities, right? If you don't put police inside those dorm rooms, then they're not going to find as many acts of drug abuse or illegal drug use as you would if you did deploy them there. So the real problem, and it gets a little more tricky. That I don't think this argument is like the end all be all, because there definitely are social problems that are particular and more pervasive in deprived communities. So it's not saying that, I'm not saying that, there's an equal amount of violence in rich neighborhoods as there are poorer neighborhoods. But it is to say there's a lot of violence, such as domestic violence, that's simply never going to get reported in richer neighborhoods. So, we can't look at the police's data sets as if they were constructed and produced in this sort of scientifically neutral manner. In any other science, you look at the conditions in which the data are produced. And so when I see sort of predictive analytics being introduced into policing under the sort of auspice that it's scientifically based, it's not scientific in the least sense of the word. So that would be sort of my specific critique of the way that the algorithms are used in criminal justice.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things that I found in reading your book, and that's been a discussion, I think, among a lot of people interested in this kind of work is, as you said, what's being counted or what's being observed. Maybe you could say a little bit about the issue of race, because it seems that early on, which you highlight before even computers were around, people were trying to make arguments about what they call colored people and the amount of crime that they would do compared to whites. And so they were counting, to whatever problematic extent, they were counting race, and they were, making arguments about that. And so it would seem that maybe if you take away race, then you take away racism. But of course, when the New York police departments that were doing the stop and frisk wanted to take away race or to not divulge the race, people fought against that because it actually helped them sort of hide racism. Whereas if you count the number of people of different racial backgrounds who are stopped and frisked, you can see clear racist policy. So in that case, it's actually good to count race in the sense that it demonstrates racial bias. So how do we weigh, I guess, the pros and cons in different circumstances of counting things like race? Because it seems to be able to be used by white supremacists, as you mentioned in the book, to show that if a lot of people of color are arrested, that means they're more prone to crime. But on the other hand, if you ignore race, then you ignore racial disparities. So how do we weigh these pros and cons sort of
counting something like race? Yeah, that's a great and a really tough question.
Not a simple one we're going to solve today, perhaps.
Yeah. And I mean, it's something that, I think it was a tension, and I don't know that I did the greatest job of it in my book, but to not come across as a techno-pessimist, because, technology in many ways, it's the way that it's used to some extent. It could be used progressively, conservatively, for fascistic reasons, for emancipatory reasons. But I would say that I've come to this is where I believe discourse analysis is really helpful in thinking about a data set and discourse and thinking about the data as sort of components or bits of discourse. And so that means they can be interpreted different ways. We can interpret the fact that in 2017, something like 88% of all marijuana arrests, 88 million people 88% of people arrested in New York City for marijuana charges were either Black or Latinx. We can interpret this different ways. We can interpret it that Black and Latinx people smoke marijuana more, or we can interpret it as the police are arresting Black and Latinx people for smoking marijuana more. I think one of the things is that we should keep in mind is the way that these data, they can be interpreted in different ways, but the point is to not sort of let the numbers mystify us and sort of bow down to them as sort of some mirror reflection of reality. But I think that, the sort of gestalt switch that you can play when it comes to criminal justice data, at least, is that you could easily say, well, those data actually tell us more about the activity of the criminal justice system than they tell us about the population at large. And that's what I came to see and believe in writing the book.
Yeah, well, for people who are concerned with the information that's being kept, particularly kept, as in not erased after a certain period of time, what are sort of the pros and cons of that people should be aware of? Because, of course, if you have a large data set of people, particularly people of color from at-risk neighborhoods, who then can be, I guess, monitored more, surveyed more, as opposed to people who, like the police we're seeing more and more frequently, I guess, in the news lately, where there's been a lot of warnings, or they've had a lot of investigations into themselves, but that ends up getting erased, or it's supposed to be erased from their police record after a certain amount of time. There's sort of like a forgiveness or something. So on one side of things, it seems like it's good to have information and to keep that information, but there are many more voices, it seems, as of late, saying it's good to sort of erase information after a certain period. How do you weigh those issues?
Yeah, this is also, it's very similar, I think, to the stop and frisk case that I looked at. Mm-hmm. But I do think, of course, if I had a magic wand, I would erase. I think on balance, it's better to erase them. You could see a world in which when somebody has a record, well, it's already here, actually. Mm-hmm. All you have to do is a Google search or a background check to see if that person has a criminal record, and you can deny them housing, you can deny them employment, you can deny them licenses, driver's licenses, etc. And in that case, there's been a lot of more attention directed toward China and China's social credit system. In writing the book, I have actually come to believe that we are closer to that system than we might like to think, at least in this country as Americans. Mm-hmm. It's just that it doesn't all operate through the state. It is dispersed and it operates much more through the private market. And that's where I definitely think the control society theory does a lot of work for me. But so I do think on balance, it's better to abolish those data, because what they're doing, I think, is they're enabling non-criminal justice institutions to work in unison in punishing criminalized individuals and populations by just putting in the person's name into the database saying, I can't give you the job. And my fear is that, you could almost see a dark future where mm-hmm. human patrol officers are no longer needed, right? Where a camera picks up somebody where it's surveilling in a criminalized neighborhood and, sends that person's sanction to a court who deems the person guilty, and then they become a pariah sort of in the 21st century through these computer networks. So in that sense, I definitely think you should abolish them. On the other hand, I think if we do abolish those data, we should think a lot more about producing data ourselves and data sets ourselves to be able to document these encounters, to make sure that we still do have it. I think maybe it's old fashioned, but I do believe it's always better to have, the empirical evidence to go along with our argument about racist policing. And, even if you do have the empirical evidence, obviously that's not enough, I think, to overturn it. But I think it does help, and, it can be used to sort of draw more allies. Might not be so caught up in these issues.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of the things that struck me in reading it. It's not necessarily the major point of your book or anything, but the idea that police unions seem to fight very hard so that records of police are expunged after a certain amount of time, or that, whatever warnings they've had, if they don't do something again, then it goes away. So they seem very concerned sort of with erasing these histories. But then on the other hand, they seem very concerned with keeping as much data as they can in relation to the populations that they're surveying. And so it's something that you don't necessarily think about or see until you see some of these legal challenges that are going on, and the idea of, filming police officers, like you said, and keeping empirical data on what's going on outside of police records. But then also, as you mentioned, a lot of this is done through private technology companies, and best case scenario, none of these companies are racist. They're not, actively pursuing a racist agenda in any way. They're also not pursuing, arguably, a state agenda because they're private companies, and yet they can be instrumental, of course, in perpetuating sort of racist criminal justice systems. What are some of the ways that you've seen that happen? And also, I'm curious about how you were able to study that, particularly when a lot of these things are very much private, in the sense that you can't see the algorithms, you can't see the data sets, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's where the racial capitalism framework is really powerful, because it shows that, we live in a capitalist country, and it was capitalist from the beginning, but it was also racialized from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And the combination created conditions in which there are economic incentives to participate in racist practices or racist initiatives, or just everyday racist behaviors. There are economic incentives from distancing yourself from criminalized, stigmatized people, to helping, fight crime, which is a euphemism for containing and quarantining those stigmatized populations. I think the framework shows that you don't have to be a conscious, I'm personally someone who's not all that privy to calling an individual racist. Because, of course, there are clearly individuals who you say that's a racist person, but I'm more focused on the structural dimension of racism, where people knowingly or unknowingly perpetuate it because the society is structured in a way in which there's an incentive to perpetuate racism. And with the IT sector, I think you're seeing a lot of people are starting to, look at it and, from different angles and the different sort of ways that it's entangled in white supremacy, whether you see the current, of course, debates over Twitter and Facebook, of course, or we also look at sort of the way that the cloud computing that's provided for the Department of Homeland Security and the recent attacks on undocumented Latinx immigrants. So they're just entangled with these broader political and social policies. And the IT sector is very interesting because at least the sort of stereotypical Silicon Valley image is one of multiculturalism and one of libertarianism. What I've found is that, it could ostensibly or through its discourse be, multicultural and libertarian, but in the case that I'm looking at, it's the opposite of multicultural. It's racist, and it's the opposite of libertarian. It's actually hyper-interventionist. And how do we account for that contradiction? And that's what racial capitalism is saying, is that these contradictions are papered over or they're rationalized when the person who bears the short end of the stick is non-white, is poor, is et cetera, is marginalized. What I was trying to do, or what I found, was that it's easy to just beat up on the IT sector and say they're the big, of course, big tech is the new big industry, and I think that's true. But it's almost as if we don't have to even, intentionality doesn't even have to be part of the equation, and that's the point of when you do a structural analysis of racism. The intentionality of the individual, the subjectivity of the individual is not the focal point of analysis. It's the way in which that individual is inserted into a system in which they're incentivized or encouraged to help perpetuate racism and even discourage anti-racist critique.
Yeah, well, one of the aspects of a larger structural analysis, like you're alluding to here, is the idea of, I guess, moving beyond the individual, which makes sense because, an individual can be participating in a racist structure without necessarily being racist. But I think it also, when reading about that, can seem like individual actions don't really matter then, or you can't really do anything as an individual, whether you're in a tech company, whether you're a police officer or what have you. How do you weigh that idea? Like, how do you consider the actions that we can take, whether we're in a particular system, meaning, working for the police or working in law or working for IT or working in education, like I think a lot of us listening to and reading your book, I think a lot of us are involved in education, higher ed. Where is the role, or how do you envision the role of the individual when we're talking about such huge structural problems?
Yeah. And, that's definitely, something, a very important question and one that I'm always happy to talk about. I think to move beyond individualism and think socially, the dialectic between the individual and the society that they live in, but not to get too far into the clouds. But one of the things that I found in New York City, especially with the stop and frisk, was I came in there as a Black scholar, mostly interested in anti-Black police violence and anti-Latinx police violence was sort of where I initially gravitated toward. And the more I dug into the debate over stop and frisk, the more I saw this trans community, sex worker community, homelessness, the homeless communities, and you started to see different groups of people. Mm-hmm. So the first part, what can the individual do to I think, is to try to look at and try to think about how different struggles across different groups sort of look the same, and of course try to figure out a way in which they can develop, or we can develop, a language in which we can talk across groups, respecting their differences, but also being very attentive to what we have in common, which I think is something that's sort of been lost in a lot of social theory is what do we have in common between individuals and between different groups? That's one thing. But then the other thing is, it's just like, I think, how do you solve racism is just like saying, how do you solve sexism or capitalism as an individual? Mm-hmm. The reason that it's difficult to figure it out is because of their position of power. So I think that if you are in the IT sector, just bringing these discussions to the IT sector and, starting to talk more about how the technology is being used. I think the Facebook example is a good example of, that I think sacrificing their career or quitting, I think is a very bold move. And I understand that. Of course, most people can't do that. But I think that was, to me, encouraging that you see the IT sector and people within it saying, wait a second, what is our relationship to a lot of major political problems that are happening right now? That doesn't mean you have to quit your job, but just to be cognizant of it and to talk about it and to make it sort of more a mainstream and normalized discussion within your within your own individual life, I think is one thing. And internet definitely helps in disseminating or propagating these types of discussions. So I think talking about it, of course, not all of us can do it, but those who can, lending our bodies in the street to protest, to create the spectacle, and a bigger spectacle that we see has sort of spread virally across the planet. So if that's what you can do, I would say do that. If you're in research in the educational system, then, we can start with our own industry. I think higher education and think about the ways in which we are reproduce inequalities, whether that be through pedagogical practices, whether that be through the way we build our syllabi, or the way that we structure our discussions, or even the types of assignments we give. I just think being conscious and trying to, keep these discussions mainstreamed is the best that most of us can do as individuals. Because, I think you see the other side already is trying to deny the existence of these problems, or they have for a long time. But just pushing back against that is just to keep it present and just to make sure that, we don't fall into the days when, I think for most of the people reading the broadcast or listening to this podcast with this idea of racism doesn't exist, I think most of us in at least the education industry find that to be an absurd statement. Making sure that the absurdity of the statement is something that we constantly point to is also important.
Yeah, that's a good point. To build on that a little bit, I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you approached the idea of gathering empirical evidence for racist systems and the things that you cover in the book, but describing it, like looking into it, really analyzing what's there, and then also on the other side, prescribing sort of ways that we can combat this. Perhaps it's activism, perhaps it's intervention in other ways, but I think it's tempting, and I think a lot of books that I've read lately kind of do one or the other. I mean, you do both to different extents, but there's this idea like we have to show racism if we're going to fight it. And so people might spend a full book exploring the empirical evidence for racism in a given system. And then others might give a sort of inspirational, here's where we should go, here's what we should be doing. How do you weigh how much of that to do? And maybe you found some kind of balance in your own work, or maybe you're still struggling like I am and a lot of people are, I think, in finding some kind of balance. But maybe you could say a little bit about how you weigh how much sort of description you'll do and how much prescription you'll do.
Yeah, like you said, that is a struggle, and I definitely have not overcome it. I would say a couple things. First, there often, I think, unfortunately, can be sort of an implicit divide between research and activism when I think both are pieces of a larger puzzle. If you're good at, reading articles in computer science journals and finding the methodological flaws and being able to articulate those flaws in a way that is comprehensible to other computer scientists, if you're good at that, I think then, you should concentrate, a lot of energy in doing that, because that's a skill that not everybody has. If you're a great public speaker, orator, I think, or have public charisma or are good with organizing, I think then, you can concentrate your energies on that. I think that different people have different personalities and different skill sets. And for me, the question is, how do we mobilize all of these different skill sets in a way that's, constructively working towards one end? So I do think it is in part the academics' wheelhouse to look at what's happening in the quote unquote cutting edge of their discipline, which usually means the computer science, the digitized, part of their discipline, and to try to keep a critical eye towards what's happening in the academic field, because oftentimes it's these academics who function as consultants, in my case, for police departments. That's one part of the work. And then there's also, and I actually do think that's activism. I do think that research is a manifestation it can be, of activism. Mm-hmm. And then, I think that there are people who are, there are some academics who are really great in speaking publicly. I don't know if that's the majority of academics, but there are also, there are folks, of course, who are really great public speakers. I'm watching Trevor Noah, and I'm like, man, he's able to explain systematic racism, I think, better than most academics I know, to really break it down, without needing jargon. And so that's just shows you that, it's a different skill, a different type of discourse, which is very important. And I would say that, because oftentimes with academic work, there is definitely this question of what to do, and how do we get out of the sort of situation that the academic portrays. But I think it's important to say that while that definitely is something that I believe should be built in to our research, I also think it's dangerous to think that a book, any book, from a religious book to a philosophical book, is something that you can read and it can tell you what to do. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a realistic expectation, and I don't think it should be an expectation of an academic. And I know that's not a very popular view. I found out the hard way in conferences, but I still maintain that we shouldn't necessarily be saying, hey, public, or hey, students, read my book and I'll tell you what you should do. I think rather what we can do is give insights into something that's hidden or not discussed, and saying, hey, this is another part of this is a way you can approach this debate, or, this is another lens through which you can see these different social problems. It has to be something more synergistic in coming up with a solution, because I do not have the solution to racial criminalization. And I don't have any delusions of thinking I would ever find that solution. But what I was trying to do personally with the book was to say, okay, we're looking at the way that this technology is used. One of the sort of trends that you see are that people are fixating on the algorithms, and they're looking at the algorithms and they're saying, well, what variables are being analyzed in those algorithms? What are the data dictionaries that are inserted in those software? That's definitely one way of critiquing it. But what I was trying to do was say, hey, guys, let's not only look at sort of, deconstruct the algorithms, because to me, that's no different than deconstructing a book, or an article, a racist book or an article. But for me, it's putting that algorithm within its historical context and saying, hey, this algorithm is being used to perpetuate the very same policing tactics and the very same criminal justice policies that were being rolled out, in the 80s, in some cases in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And, why it seems more sanitized and it seems more scientific, writing something in mathematical notation to me is equivalent to writing it in French or in German. It's just a different language. But if the sentences are to instruct officers to flood communities which are racked with social problems, and using that as a technique to solve the social problems, then, let's forget about the algorithm and let's turn towards the broader context and the political agenda that those algorithms were originally designed to enact. So I do think, that's a long-winded answer, but
there's lots in there, yeah.
Yeah, but so so I do think, like, as the academic, we can influence public discourse, but I don't think we should be looked at as political leaders. Definitely not. I think that actually would be disastrous in many cases.
Yeah, well, it's just funny to hear that, because I'm thinking more and more as I look at sort of, what's on the top of Amazon lists, or are living in rural Georgia, which in many ways is great, but in some ways, when a computer algorithm kind of sees, oh, you live in rural Georgia, you like this book by these Fox News hosts or something, I kind of see the opposite of what you're talking about, whereas they have a very clear, like, you should do the following steps and that will make America great again. And I see like the opposite happening, I guess, in a more popular and more dangerous, I think, way of communicating, where it is very much like, I have the answers, follow these steps. And I think that's one of the challenges of academics, is that we're competing with those to a certain extent, obviously not on the exact same level. But if somebody's looking to understand the world and one guy says, I have all the answers, and another person says, I'm struggling with this critical theory of whatever, I can understand why the discourses are displaced a little bit. But also, going back to what you said about algorithms and looking beyond those, I forget who it was I was speaking to. I think it was Andrew Ferguson who wrote the Rise of Big Data Policing. But the idea is always, it seems like there's a problem with an algorithm, or with even an IT sector, perhaps. How are we going to fix that? I know, we'll get a new algorithm, or we'll get a new IT sector to fix this one. And so that, it's a recursive problem perhaps, but also it doesn't seem like that's going to go away, in the sense that we're going to continue using computer models. We're going to continue using algorithms, even if we don't necessarily call it that. Maybe we call it AI or machine learning or something. Yeah. Is there an outside to it that we should be thinking about, outside of algorithms, outside of these IT solutions? Or is there a way of working within it? Maybe that's the evil we know, and we have to work with computer scientists. Is there an outside to computer science, I guess, is what I'm asking. And how should we consider these things? Because it does seem like every problematic computer program or system gets replaced by a newer one that will inevitably be problematic as well. I also, though, don't see us going back to not using computers or something.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Well, I just think of it in terms of a technocratic solution to a social problem. You're right. We will say, oh, well, we'll just improve the technology. We'll improve the equation, or we'll find a new equation or algorithm or whatever. But I think one of the morals of the story, and this is not new. This is Hannah Arendt's writing about this. Weber is writing about this a century ago. Right. This idea of a purely bureaucratized technocracy dictating social policy. So I think, the good news is that there's a century worth of work that I don't find that the computerized present in that respect. Of course, it is advanced to the nth degree in having an algorithm dictate everything from worker schedules to who works in what cubicle, right, to where the police officer should patrol. It's important, again, to think of the long history of that. We live in a very technocratic state, especially since World War II. And so the critique should be, not on just the individual algorithm, but the role of having a technocratic elite. One of the things I found that I think is shocking was, a lot of the computer scientists who helped develop these predictive policing algorithms, they have no background whatsoever in any social science, much less social theory and God forbid, humanities. Like no background whatsoever. You have people who are in California, you have mathematicians who worked on designing algorithms for seismology, who are making stuff for crime. You have in Chicago a epidemiologist working on algorithms for the Chicago Police Department. I talked to people in Carnegie Mellon who are doing machine learning. They are being flown around the country to help police departments design predictive algorithms. So for me, it's like, just forget about the entire algorithm. Like, this whole picture to me looks wrong. And we should critique this idea of having these non-experts masquerading as experts, or masquerading as if they have any constructive solution to the problem. So there's that. But to your point, computers aren't going anywhere. But I don't know, I've sort of come to, I think it's important to think that, the algorithm and computer-generated knowledge is language, and language has always been used in ways to justify oppressing and killing people. So, it's not, it might seem inescapable, but I'm always struggling with how new, our computerized present is, and I do think as academics, we, to get published, we do have this impulse to say this is the new society, this is the new state of affairs. We all want to have that breakthrough book where everyone is writing a book on this is the new paradigm, and everyone has a different word for this paradigm. And I think that is is running its course, and I think what in the new media studies you are seeing, I think especially people engage in science studies, are looking at so we have to figure out what is new in the present, but it might not be as new as we think, right? The computers are used in many ways to extract, whether it's unpaid labor, to give this person more than that person, to value this home as a more valuable, this piece of property than that piece of property, to send more police in this neighborhood, to racially profile that person, to sexually discriminate that person. But that's not new, right? Once we start looking at the way that technologies are used, at least for disadvantaged and minoritized and marginalized groups, it's the same snake, but with different skin. So what I found with the book is, we could look in the past for inspiration. Ida B. Wells was, someone who was looking, an advocate for anti-lynching laws. And, she was talking about the way that white crime is not tabulated, we can look at, slave plantations where systematic rape of Black women was, well established. And these were not, of course, these rapes didn't show up in criminal justice data sets in any way, shape, or form. Yeah. So, I think unwittingly, metamorphosized into more of a historian and saying, like, whenever we think that these challenges are insurmountable, look to the past. Look to the people who are trying to fight against lynching laws or against Jim Crow. A lot of the arguments they were having are similar to what we're having now. And maybe they were looking at, racial or racist political rhetoric. So we look at racist algorithms, but I don't know that it's qualitatively different. It's just a different manifestation of language to me.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that, because the more I talk to people who are doing new media studies of whatever contemporary issues we're dealing with, the more I hear that kind of thing, like, this looks very similar to the past. And I mean, you do some really important work here, contextualizing the issues that are at stake. Is there anything, as we start to sort of wrap up this interview, is there anything that you think needs to be done, whether that's by perhaps junior scholars or more advanced people outside of the academy, maybe working in tech? Is there anything that you think needs to be done in terms of more contextualization, more exploration? I mean, what are avenues that you think are perhaps kind of ripe for more analysis in relation to the work that you've done? Yeah.
Well, first, I would say, and, again, I think what I appreciate in media studies, a lot of new media scholars, is that we don't have, for social theorists in the academy or who do social theory or cultural theory, we don't have to be anti-technology. Because then it becomes, unwittingly technological determinism. So you don't have to, and, I know with my book I thought, oh God, I'll never get a job in San Francisco because of the way that the IT sector is portrayed. But I think one of the things that we should do is to take, I'll say academia first, is to take more time to, learn, we don't have to learn code or anything like that, but to read technology journals and magazines and read scientific works in the field of computer and data science, and to develop the vocabulary in which we can actually have conversations with those people. It's very difficult to do in the present climate, but I think we have to learn their language to be able to communicate to them on their terms in a more clear way what our criticism is. And then, for IT people, I think you're seeing it for the past year, at least in this country. Slowly, you're seeing a steady drip of people in the IT sector who are starting. I think popular books such as Weapons of Mass Destruction is a great book in that regard, because it's more of course, she's a scientist originally, so she's able to talk, to the scientific community, I think, in a more sort of accessible way. And I think Kathy O'Neill, sorry, I was blanking on her name. I think you are seeing more people in the IT sector, again, because I teach a lot of computer science majors at my university. It's an engineering university, and they simply don't get and oftentimes they're not interested in sort of basic social theoretic concepts, or things you or I would take for granted, contextualize the numbers. But I think you're seeing more of that, and I think it might have started with the March for Science, which I thought it was interesting because I said, well, if you STEM people were listening to us for the past 20 or 30 years, you might have saw this coming. But I think they are starting. It's very simple, and I don't think we have to use very sort of jargonistic theoretical language to say, look, just put the stuff that you're doing in context. But I think that's happening slowly, and hopefully it will happen more. As academics and as people in the IT sector, we should try to think of ways of actually interacting with one another and getting into conversation with one another, and then of course bringing the communities, people outside of these sort of privileged positions, their ideas into the fold. Because then one of the things I would say in that, no book is going to tell you what to do. I think academics and IT workers, we can listen to people on the ground who are being the most affected by this, and we could get concepts from them. And that's, that is the hallmark of critical theory, is the concepts grow out of the struggle. And they should change according to the struggle. That's what critical theory was. And it's become, a bit of an empty signifier, I think, now. But its original roots were generating or producing knowledge through social struggle. So we should look for that knowledge, I think, from people who are embroiled in the struggle, and see, as academics or IT people, what we could add to those concepts to refine them or disseminate them.
Yeah. I mean, Brian, you've highlighted, I think, a really great way of concluding the ideas that you've put forward, I guess, in your book and also in this discussion. You kind of highlight some of the really scary and dangerous elements of technology and criminal justice, but you also, as you just did, highlight ways that we can confront that. And I think, all of that work is really valuable, and I really appreciate you speaking to me today, Brian.
Oh, no. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me, Chris.
Once again, thank you so much for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. I really am thrilled to be able to speak with such great thinkers in so many diverse fields. It's something that I missed quite a bit as a journalist in Toronto when I moved up to the Enchanted Valley, as they call it, or also rural Georgia. And I'm just so happy that I can continue having those conversations, albeit from a distance and albeit from my home office during COVID. But thank you again to listeners, to interviewees, and to everyone who's partaking in the important work that's being done as we try to understand and unpack what's happening in our societies. Don't forget to check out tinap.org. You can see Brian's recommended readings as well as everyone else's. You can listen to older podcasts, which are still, I think, pretty timely. And I'll be back in 2 weeks. I plan to come out with new interviews every 2 weeks for the duration of this year and into next for the general school year. Please share widely. Please keep reading and encouraging this kind of research. I think it's more important than ever. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.